Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim and you're watching Turkish Diplomacy. On today's episode, political analyst John Kavalic will be joining me to discuss Turkish President Erdoğan's visit to Italy, Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney, and U.S. President Donald Trump's actions in the first 100 days of his presidency. But before we begin our discussions, let's take a look at this news report.
Akdeniz'in güvenliği, Orta Doğu'daki durum, Avrupa'nın istikrarı ve transatlantik bağın muhafazası gibi önemli meselelerde aramızda değerli bir uyum bulunuyor. Ortak coğrafyamız olan Akdeniz'de hem ülkelerimize hem de bölgeyle fayda sağlayacak enerji projeleri konusunda da birlikte çalışmaya hazırız. Ukrayna'nın toprak bütünlüğü ve egemenliğine olan güçlü desteğimizi vurguladık. Karadeniz'in güvenliğine özellikle sağlanmasında asli aktör olarak Türkiye çözüme dönük çabalara katkı sağlamaya devam edecek. İsrail'in insanlık dışı uygulamalarının sahne olan Gazze önemli gündem maddelerimiz arasında yer aldı. 2 aydan bu yana insani yardımların girişine dahi izin verilmeyen Gazze'deki ateşkese bir an önce geri dönülmesi önceliğimizdir. Libya'nın istikrarı ve refahının muhafazası için uzun vadeli ve sürdürülebilir çözümler üzerinde birlikte çalışmaya devam edeceğiz. Suriye'de ülkenin yeniden inşası, kurumlarının güçlendirilmesi ve toprak bütünlüğünün muhafazasına yoğunlaşmış durumdayız. Bu amaç doğrultusunda İtalya'nın Suriye'de oynadığı yapıcı role ve bilhassa yeniden inşa sürecinde Türkiye-İtalya ortaklığına değindik. Bu konudaki istişarelerimizin devamında mutabık kaldık.
Welcome back to the program. Now, John Kavalic, welcome to the program as well. Let's start with Turkish President Erdoğan's visit to Italy. There were many statements that were made at the end of the meeting yesterday. We saw Erdoğan and Meloni talking about Gaza, about Syria, about bilateral projects, bilateral ties, energy projects. I want to start by asking you, John, how important is this visit of Erdoğan to Italy to discuss these relations with the European Union as well?
Well, first, optically, very few heads of state do trade missions and do visits as well as President Erdoğan does. He uses all of the trappings of his office, whether it's the vehicles, whether it's the aircraft, whether it's bringing the delegations of senior executives from Turkey-based companies, and along bringing with him his ministers and that. So he does that really well. And he always looks to use every moment of any visit to get something done. The statements by Prime Minister Meloni and President Erdoğan, reflected that. There was a lot discussed. Syria, Libya, 2 important, potentially financially beneficial opportunities for both countries. The challenge, though, is that while President Erdoğan needs help from EU countries, not all the EU countries are willing to do as much as they know they really need to do. And so President Erdoğan, he needs to try to balance, which is the challenge here, how much he can ask for and then reasonably expect to get.
John, I want to touch upon the defense ties between the two countries. We've seen over the past few years that their ties have been increasing, and last year, the Turkish firm, which is Baykar, it bought Piaggio Aerospace of Italy. So that was a $500 million deal as well. And yesterday, during the press conference, Meloni said that, touching upon our bilateral ties, improving our defense ties would create opportunities for Europe. What sort of opportunities can we see opening up for Europe in this collaboration between Turkey and Italy?
Well, primarily for Bakhtiar, this potentially gets them in the door of that $150 billion defense spending budget that the European Union has been talking about, because there are members of the European Union who are saying, wait a minute, we don't want the Americans to come in and absorb all of that money. We want companies within the European Union. So this gives an entree for Turkey-based company to get into that. And that's very important because there are European Union members who want defense products from Turkey. This gives them an opportunity to sort of slide in without ruffling a lot, because it already has a direct foreign investment by a Turkey company in an Italy-based company. And now you have this additional, bilateral with an Italy-based company.
And also, John, we've seen over the last few years, and especially after the war broke out in Ukraine, we saw that Turkey began exporting its defense equipment. Yep. For example, drones, they were sent to Ukraine. Poland has bought a huge number of drones as well. And it's not just European countries. There are countries in Asia as well. For example, Pakistan has purchased defense equipment for Turkey. What does this tell us about when, Erdoğan says Turkey needs to be self-sufficient? So is this a good way to reach that final goal of being self-sufficient and not relying on European or Western partners?
The challenge with defense exports is that we would really all like defense exports to be less everywhere, because that would generally signal less conflict that everyone has to focus on. And so when President Trump is saying, look, 2%, 3%, we want people spending 5% of GDP on defense, and the U.S. may spend $1 trillion this fiscal year, people are like, well, that could go to roads and bridges and education and healthcare and the rest. But with Turkey, having a landscape that isn't just EU-based is critically important. And there are countries, as warfare changes and it becomes less person-centric and it becomes more electronic, drone technology, missile technology, satellite technology, what Turkey is investing in, that all makes Turkey a player in the defense industry. So President Erdoğan's right in terms of when he's going to all these countries, he's saying, yes, our construction companies are amazing and do work all over the world. And we have retail products and we have financial products. But our defense industry is pretty strong, and countries are recognizing that.
Talking about, John, like you said, the satellite, last week Turkey launched the Turksat 6A. So this goes on to show us that Turkey is involved in all these high-tech developments, and it has more projects and plans as well. For example, if you look at Vision 2030, that is one of Erdoğan's key aspect of reshaping the entire government and the country. So let me talk about, there was another important thing that was mentioned in the meeting between Erdoğan and Meloni, and that was the bilateral trade volume. Yep. Now, both of these countries are saying they're going to increase their trade volume to $40 billion. How do you look at that trade volume? Do you think there is potential for more?
It's fairly balanced. I think Italy to Turkey was around 19 billion. I think that Turkey to Italy was around 14 or so. So it's not way off balance, and it has increased dramatically from the last time that the two governments said, here's our goal. So they've moved pretty quickly. A lot of times people forget that Turkey is basically the 16th largest economy in the world. It's a $1.5 trillion economy. And so it's, yes, it has location, but also there's a lot that it can deliver. It has a lot of throw weight commercially. And I think that's what we're seeing, with the statements by Prime Minister Meloni and President Erdoğan. The good news for both of them is that because of when they came into office, they pretty much have the electoral moments in order to see this through. So they have an ability to hold each other accountable, but also to see where the opportunities lie. And my guess is, as Russia-Ukraine war continues to transition, Gaza continues to transition, Libya continues to transition, Syria continues to transition, you're going to see a lot more opportunities. But President Erdoğan was, and he mentioned in his statement, the annoying part of his dealings with all EU members has been visas for Turkey-U.S. citizens, whether they're business or tourism, and it's about Schengen. And so with Prime Minister Meloni being considered a heavyweight in terms of EU heads of government, she might be able to be a good vessel to help deliver that message to Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, saying, we really need to make some things happen here.
John, another thing that was discussed yesterday was the ceasefire in Gaza. Now, we all know Erdoğan's position. Turkey and Erdoğan, his party and his government has solely focused on the Palestinian issue and a two-state solution. But if we look at what Meloni thinks and what Meloni has done over the past few months, she has shown support for Israel. She says Israel has the right to defend itself. But at the same time, these two are conflicting statements because Erdoğan is calling for the Palestinian right of resistance. How are you seeing, do you think this could be a big difference in their bilateral ties? Do you think that could impact too much, their ties? And how can they collaborate as well in order to find a peaceful solution in Gaza?
I remember at the end of 2023, Italy said that they had suspended military exports to Israel. The challenge is that now we're into the second year of this, and because the U.S. has not been able to rein in the Netanyahu government, and because every day people around the world are seeing these horrible images that come out of Gaza, with Palestinian people suffering, and Israel just keeps doing what it's doing without any consequence, other than President Trump saying, hey, Prime Minister Netanyahu, this doesn't look good. You speed this up. Well, they have speeded up. They're shrinking Gaza in terms of its square footage day by day. This is something that the EU, Italy, and Turkey are just not going to agree on because Gaza is going to continue to be more seen through the prism of being a Muslim issue, a Middle East issue, the reconstruction of Gaza, more of a Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE issue in terms of the money. And the European Union just basically doesn't want to deal with it. And so, I think President Erdoğan is going to, you look to pick your fights when you're at that level, head of state, head of government. And I don't think he's going to be pushing too much on it because at some point it's going to end, not well for the Palestinians, but it's going to end. And Turkey has much bigger commercial, economic, financial, political interests with the EU than it does with Gaza. It's an awful choice to make. That's why these men and women get elected to make it.
John, Turkey has historically been a mediator, a facilitator, a key negotiator in almost every political conflict, or global conflict, let's put it. Meloni was in Washington a few weeks ago, and we all know about the ties between President Trump and President Erdoğan. Do you believe that the Turkish government and President Erdoğan could play a huge role in mending the ties between European countries and the United States? For example, we've seen there are tariffs now. Then there are other decisions there are some decisions that both of these sides have been unable to agree upon. So how can the Turkish government play a role in order to mend the ties between Europe and the United States?
I think there are opportunities, but my counsel would probably be keep it separate, because Turkey on its own is a huge opportunity for the United States and a huge headache for the United States. The European Union is a huge opportunity for the U.S. and a huge headache for the U.S. And when they say U.S., I'm talking about the Trump-Vance administration as opposed to collectively. And so President Erdoğan would probably be best served for Turkey to let the European Union fend for itself pretty much, as the European Union has done to Turkey pretty much, but focus on the bilateral relationship, because with Donald Trump, the only consistency is inconsistency. You're his friend today, you're his enemy this afternoon, and then you're his friend for dinner. And that makes the normal head of state, head of government, bilateral relationship really tricky. And President Trump doesn't like the European Union. I mean, he has said that for years. You know, it's 40 years of a creation to rip us off. That's how he puts it. He looks at Ursula von der Leyen not as a head of state, head of government, but as an administrator. Of course, she doesn't like that. And we saw how, like someone seeking a celebrity autograph, she was running up to him at the funeral of Pope Francis. And President Erdoğan has a relationship with President Trump. And I mean, it's a good relationship, but it's not buddy-buddy because they're different interests. And I think that Turkey would be best served keep the relationship separate. If President Trump says to President Erdoğan, hey, I need you to do me a favor, reach out to Brussels, reach out to Meloni, reach out to Merz, reach out to Macron, whatever, then he absolutely does what he thinks in the best interests of, again, Turkey. So I would say keep them separate because the relationship is really, really important. I mean, Turkey, big trading partner with the U.S., a NATO member, second largest military force within NATO, and just a huge footprint everywhere.
John, thanks for that analysis on President Erdoğan's visit to Italy. Now we're going to take a look at this news report about the latest developments in the war in Ukraine.
Russian President Vladimir Putin on Monday declared a 3-day ceasefire from May 8th to the 10th in its war with Ukraine. The 72-hour truce would coincide with Putin hosting international leaders for lavish celebrations to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. Putin's move appeared aimed at signaling to the world that Russia is still interested in peace, something that Ukraine and its European allies dispute. On Monday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said U.S. President Donald Trump wants more than just a 3-day truce.
He wants to see a permanent ceasefire. I understand Vladimir Putin this morning offered a temporary ceasefire.
Speaking to reporters in New Jersey on Sunday, Trump said he was disappointed that Russia has continued to attack Ukraine.
I want to see what happens with respect to Russia, because Russia had been surprised and disappointed, very disappointed that they did the bombing of those places after discussions.
U.S. proposals on ending the 3-year war in Ukraine have called for Washington's recognition of Moscow's control over Crimea, as well as de facto recognition of Russia's hold on other parts of Ukraine. European and Ukrainian counterproposals, however, defer detailed discussion about territory until after a ceasefire is concluded.
What do you want Vladimir Putin to do? Well, I want him to stop shooting, sit down and sign a deal. And we have the confines of a deal, I believe, and I want him to sign it and be done with it and just go back to life.
Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in Rome for the funeral of Pope Francis, met in a Vatican basilica on Saturday to try to revive faltering efforts to end the war in Ukraine. After which, Trump suggested Zelensky was ready to give up Crimea, which Russia seized from it in 2014, as the price of a peace deal. But U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on Sunday that the Trump administration might abandon its attempts to broker a deal if Russia and Ukraine do not make headway.
Welcome back to the program. John, we are going to talk about Russia. We're going to talk about Ukraine as well. But before that, I want to touch upon Canada. Canada has a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, former Bank of England governor, former Bank of Canada governor. He has taken a tough stance against Trump. How are you looking at this election?
I have little connectivity. My mother was born in Canada, so I'm a Canadian citizen. But I was born in the United States, just in case anyone from the immigration services are watching in the U.S. Prime Minister Carney made an important statement where he said what the relationship was isn't what the relationship is and isn't what the relationship is going to be. It is a new era, and we need to adjust. The challenge for Canada is that with a GDP of about 2.5 trillion or that, U.S. trade is about almost 800 billion of that. So you start disrupting that flow, which is basically more than $1 billion a day, and a lot of it's cross-border, and that's one of President Trump's big issues. We send a partially built engine across the border to a Canadian. They put pieces on it, send it back to the U.S. We put pieces, and it could go like 3 or 4 times like that in a day or two. And so President Trump is saying, do we really need to be doing this? And I think Canada's going to have a rough time if President Trump continues with what he says he wants to do. And that's where Prime Minister Carney may have an advantage, because President Trump doesn't always do what he says he's going to do. He gets distracted, and he tends to want wins. And the wins, usually, he wants someone to be punished, and he wants them to tell everyone how badly he beat them. That's a part of the deal, that, yes, I won, but now you have to tell everyone that you were trumped, and I got you. Carney may figure out a way, because of his past as a banker, he's like the ultimate technocrat in that regard, but he's a successful one. So he may find ways to lessen this a bit. And but it's, for the moment, Canadians are not traveling to the U.S. like they used to. Where I'm originally from, in Buffalo, New York, it's right over the border with Canada. And a huge percentage of retail sales in Western New York, in Erie and Niagara counties, come from travelers, day travelers. They come over the bridge, they buy stuff, they go home. They come and visit Niagara Falls, the two sides, Canadian side, the U.S. side. They come to the U.S. side, they spend money. That's all drying up. What that means is sales tax revenues dry up. So now you've got the second largest county, the second largest city in New York State. All of a sudden, sales tax revenues, budgets have to be decreased, school budgets have to be decreased, infrastructure. So there's a lot of spillover here, and I think President Trump's going to have to be looking at that, and Prime Minister Carney.
Something that I find extremely outrageous is how Trump said that they're going to annex Canada, turn Canada into the 51st American state. Now, I was watching his statement, Carney's statement, a while ago, and he said that we're going to negotiate with the United States on our own terms.
Right.
And now this leaves, do you believe that this leaves Canada with the opportunity of enhancing its ties with the European Union? Because if Trump is creating so many problems with its neighbor, then I believe Carney is going to take steps which will enhance Canada's ties with the European Union.
Yeah, the one immediate result of President Trump's attack on Canada has been a reemergence of the Canada-China relationship in terms of exporting of oil and mostly oil, and then with Europe. There was talk about, could Canada become the 28th member of the European Union? No, I don't think that's going to happen. But you still have 3,000 miles of water separating Canada from Europe and Canada from Asia. So that, and then you have 300+ million consumers sitting along their border. So it makes it tough to pivot quite a bit. And also it's how much product Canada has to export that isn't already available throughout Europe, throughout Asia. And so they're somewhat hostage to the relationship with the U.S., but there's no question they're going to be trying to take advantage of, if Trump wants to put a 10, 20, 30, 50% tariff on something, well, then you're not going to have that issue if we send it to Europe, or we send it to the Middle East, or we send it to the Americas. But it's still going to be a challenge.
John, over the last few months, you've been traveling a lot. You've been traveling extensively in the Middle East. You've been in Europe. You've visited Ukraine, Russia, Moldova. Now you're in Turkey. We can talk about the war. We can talk about who's providing the weapons. We can talk about financial assistance. We can talk about the decisions that the governments have made. But since you've been in Russia and Ukraine, I want to ask you about your experience. What did you see in Ukraine? What did you see in Russia? Tell me, how are people feeling? How are people being impacted by the war? Let's start with Ukraine first.
You know, I was in Ukraine when the war started, in Kharkiv, on the 24th of February, 2022. And I've been returning to different areas, whether it's Odessa, Kharkiv, Sumy, Zaporizhzhia, Dnipro, Lviv, etc. So moving throughout the country to see how the war impacts. And it's been a huge challenge for the Ukrainians, because for most of them, prior to the 2024 or 2022, the war that had been going on for 10 years at that point, Crimea, being taken, and then Luhansk, Donetsk, and on the eastern portions, it hadn't really been moving. So the real estate wasn't moving, and people were just going along with their lives. But what happened 2022 was horrific. And over time, they've shown an incredible resilience. But sometimes that resilience has created some optical problems. Like, for example, not long after 2022, into the end of 2022, 2023, you could find fresh oysters from France at hotels and restaurants. You could find fresh lobsters. You could find the best wines. This particular phone, the Samsung S23 Ultra, it was available at a Samsung store in Kharkiv, Ukraine, 3 days before it was available in the United States. So there has always been this bifurcation between the areas that have been directly impacted by the war and then the rest of the country. And then you move to Russia, and I've spent time in Kursk, I've spent time in Belgorod, and primarily the reason being is they're the closest cities to the border with Ukraine, as Kharkiv, Sumy are the closest to Russia. So they're basically good laboratories for how people are coping. And you find, on the Ukraine side, that there's a desire to get this over with. Russia, the same thing. I asked a group of students in Russia, and I said, tell me, how many of you support the war? And they would raise their hands, almost all of them. Same in Ukraine. How many of you use social media, Facebook, Instagram, to show your support for the war? Almost every hand goes up. How many of you have volunteered to serve? No one.
None of them.
And so young people want this over. And they blame old people. Generally, the comments I got was, this is a bunch of old white guys that started all of this. And they are not only messing around with our future, they're taking some of it away. So that's how it looks to looks in both countries. But there isn't a lot of appetite for this at the higher levels. The war is an industry, but it's not just the industry that people think, which is defense companies get rich selling stuff. But there's also a huge business in conferences, consultants, people that are pontificating, people that are analyzing. And it gives people an opportunity to be relevant, to make money. And they're very good at when the war is escalating. But they're not very good at going the other way. And that's where we all now are now.
But John, this will have a lasting impact, right? Because families have been destroyed. Young men have been conscripted to fight for the Ukrainian army, for the Russian army. And thousands of people have died in this war. Now, the problems are not just for those living in these countries, but also those who have been, who are refugees, who are seeking asylum in different countries. For example, there's so many Russians and Ukrainians who came to Turkey as well to seek refuge from the war in Ukraine. So now that sentiment has also changed, right? Because in Europe, look at Poland. It's not willing to host Ukrainian refugees or Russian refugees. So how is that changing the entire aspect of this war? Because Europeans don't want all of these people to come to their countries now.
And this has been a challenge. When the war started, Europe opened its doors to the Ukrainians and to Russians in some respects. But Poland, like no other country. Now, from an economic standpoint, though, at that point, Poland did need workers. So the Ukrainians were filling some voids. But over time, pressure on wages, pressures on home rentals and apartment rentals, and pressure on social services, pressure on educational services. And so the pendulum has somewhat shifted where these governments, when the war started, everything's macro. And that was in the European Union as well. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, for as long as it takes, and so everything was blossomy and flowery, and the oration was wonderful. But over time, you go from macro to micro issues. And that's where we are now, where these countries are saying, wait a minute, Ukraine's flooding our markets with agricultural products. We have young people now that we need you to go back because, one, Ukraine needs you to go back. And it would sort of be helpful to us, too, to lessen some of our financial burdens if you went home, too. And it's a struggle because no one wants to say to someone, your country's at war, I really don't care, I need to rent this apartment for more money to someone else, you gotta go. But that's somewhat the message that's being given. I'm in a minority on this, but I never thought that the war, that Russia's reason for attacking Ukraine was all about NATO membership. I've always felt it was about European Union membership, because European Union membership is much more consequential to Russia to have a European Union member that potentially would, when it became a member, could be the 6th largest member of the European Union automatically along 1,200 miles of its borders. So right over the borders, people in Russia are seeing how people in Ukraine are living, how the government structure is different, opportunities are different. But with that, though, also comes a tremendous amount of stress points. And so, I think that we're going to continue to see, the closer that Ukraine believes it is to European membership, maybe the further away it actually is. But we'll see how it all plays out.
Yes, of course, it's extremely distressing, when you go to Ukraine or Russia and you see what people are facing. And we hope, of course, that a ceasefire is on the horizon. John, we're in the final minutes of our program. I quickly want to touch upon President Trump's first 100 days in office. Yesterday, we discussed Trump's foreign policy approach. Today, I want to ask you a few questions about what's happening internally in the United States. There's migration. That's probably the biggest issue that Trump says he's facing. They declared a national emergency at the southern border. Right. Is this a legitimate security need, or is it just political messaging from Trump?
One person's security issue is another person's political message. President Trump was brilliant in tapping into a failure of the Biden administration. Now, to be fair to President Biden, when he came into office, he left in place the Biden or the Trump era migration regulations, and it remained low. He got pressure from members of his party, and he reversed. And it was a disaster for him. And President Trump, or then candidate President Trump, former President Trump, exploited it. And it's an easy issue for people to look at. And they see people are here illegally, they're grabbing resources, grabbing jobs, and then the media reporting on the crimes that are being committed. So he's taken a legitimate security issue, made it into a political issue, and it's worked brilliantly for him. And he's executing it. Yes, there have been controversies over with children and sending to El Salvador and the rest, but overall, it's a good issue for him.
John, also, the tariffs that Trump has introduced. For an average American, that would make life difficult. Probably not in the short term, but in the long term, definitely, because of higher prices. Your basic goods are going to be worth more. What is the public sentiment right now in the United States? How are people looking at the decisions that President Trump has taken so far?
There's just confusion. But you look at the stock market, which is always a gauge, even though most people don't own stocks, but they look every morning. They see the Dow go up and down, the S&P go up and down. The stock market has basically recovered the crater that was created after he announced Liberation Day. It's pretty much back to where it was when he took office. And so why is that? Well, one, the stock market is a marketplace. People make things high, they make things low, they buy low, they sell high. It's a business. And it's not really surprising that that's happened. So that has sort of created a little bit of a platform for him. But there's still a lot of uncertainty. But he also is only looking to satisfy the 50% of the voters who voted for him. So the fact that there's another 50% that thinks what he's doing is nuts, that's not where he's focusing on. He's focusing on his base. He's got some time. He's built in these excuses. It could get difficult before it gets better. We need to stay the course. I'll modify as I need to modify. But overall, he's looking at this as I said I was going to do it, and I'm doing it. And a quick thing on that, his first term, and this is where the dynamic of what is Trump and Trumpism. His first term, he came out and he said to the press corps, do you know you can send a package from Beijing, China to New York for less than you can send that same package from Chicago to New York? Well, that's because of this thing called the Universal Postal Union that sets all these rates. We're getting ripped off, and I'm stopping that. That was something that everyone, you could visualize that, and he did it. So he does have a capacity to look at issues simply and say to people it's wrong. LGBTQ issues. He said, President Biden thinks it's okay for a man dressed like a woman to use a bathroom with women. Simple messaging. And, he's like, go ahead, what are you going to do? So right now there's just confusion.
There's a lot of confusion, yeah, for sure.
And we'll see how long the long is. How much time does he have? And there's still a lot of things he's trying to do. Executive orders, he's got 200 court cases. They've got the reconciliation on doing these tax cuts. And then that's also, he wants to lessen the amount of money coming into the government, but at the same time, increase what the government's spending on, but not increase the deficit and pay down the debt. So he may need to go to remedial math class.
Senior Research Editor at Issue Insight, John Cavalish, thank you for being a part of our program today. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
That wraps up today's edition of Turkey's Diplomacy, where we analyze the global developments shaping Turkey's future. From Ankara to Washington, from Rome to Ottawa, we'll continue to bring you the stories that matter most. Thank you for watching. See you next time.